For today's webinar, we have Dr. Alexandra Clales, Associate Professor of Forensic Anthropology at Washburn University, presenting Skeletal Sex Estimation and Practitioner Use of MorphoPASSE. The Q&A session will be moderated by Michaela Askeles, a public health analyst in the Center for Forensic Sciences at RTI International. Without further delay, here's Dr. Clales.
Today I'm going to be talking about the current state of skeletal sex estimation in forensic anthropology and the practitioner use of MorphoPASSE program. But before I jump into MorphoPASSE, I want to talk about where we stand with standards for sex estimation. Minimum standards dictate what is minimally required and refer to a low-level, agreed-upon way of accomplishing something that provides support and direction or are the foundation for higher-order procedures, guidelines, and best practices. Informal standards for sex estimation were published by the Workshop of European Anthropologists and later in standards based on a series of professional workshops and conferences. These volumes were primarily designed for use with archaeological remains, but they've been widely applied for sex estimation in forensic casework as well. Later, the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History created the digital system OsteoWare. At present, we do have an agreed-upon minimum standard for sex estimation with the NCASC Standard 90. But there are no agreed-upon guidelines and best practices that put forth actual recommendations for what methods we should and should not be using, although overall suggestions are provided in the SWIGANTH document. This is further complicated by the fact that we do not have any generally accepted procedures for addressing bias, reliability, and validity of the methods available in forensic anthropology. Forensic anthropologists can generally obtain high accuracy rates for sex estimation, rates which are often higher than those achieved for age or ancestry. The highest accuracy is achievable with a complete skeleton. For example, Thomas and colleagues found 94.7% accuracy when comparing skeletal sex estimation to chromosomal sex from DNA analyses in 360 cases. The authors found that the fewer skeletal elements equate to lower accuracy, especially when lacking the most sexually dimorphic elements like the annominate, long bones, and skull, and that higher accuracy rates were achieved by those with higher education levels and ABFA certification. Likewise, Parsons' 2017 dissertation found 100% accuracy in resolved cases and 97.9% accuracy in unresolved cases where sex had been confirmed with DNA, even when missing critical diagnostic skeletal elements. While these numbers are not a post facto explanation of the error rates of forensic anthropologists, whatever forensic anthropologists are doing for sex estimation seems to be working. However, this does beg the question, what are forensic anthropologists actually doing when they estimate sex? To better understand the degree of practitioner variability, methodological preferences, and the modes of reporting, I administered a 32-question electronic survey on sex estimation in 2013. Participants were recruited either via email communication through the professional organizations listed here or through these organizations' websites. Participation in the research was anonymous, completely voluntary, and uncompensated. This research and included questionnaire were approved by the Joint Faculty Research Ethics Board at the University of Manitoba prior to being distributed. As Garvin and Passalacqua noted in their 2012 age estimation survey, collecting data like this raises awareness of our practices as a unified discipline and promotes discussion on future improvements and standardization. An attempt to remain as consistent as possible, a format similar to that used by Garvin and Passalacqua for age estimation was employed. Information was collected about the participants, including their background, training, and education, and then a multiple choice and rank systems were utilized to document their preference for estimating and reporting skeletal sex. I'll briefly cover these results to demonstrate the state of sex estimation in forensic anthropology at that point in time. Preference for skeletal region followed traditionally held beliefs that the pelvis is the most sexually dimorphic skeletal region, followed by the skull and then the long bones. These results were a bit surprising, given that research by Spradley and Jantz prior to the distribution of this survey had demonstrated that skeletal metrics of the long bones were more accurate than the use of the skull for sex estimation, especially when a multivariate approach was employed. Next, and again a bit surprising to me, was that qualitative traits were preferred over 2-to-1 when practitioners only used one or the other. However, it should be noted that most practitioners did in fact use both qualitative and quantitative methods to estimate sex. This was a bit surprising given the perceived shift to more quantitative approaches in the post-Daubert era. Of the qualitative methods available at the time, the 5 traits of Walker, which were originally published in Standards, were preferred for the skull. These include the nuchal crest, mastoid process, supraorbital margin, glabella, and the mental eminence. For the pelvis, and more specifically the pubic bone, the 3 traits of Venus were the most preferred, including the ventral arc, the subpubic concavity, and the medial aspect of the ischiopubic ramus. Overwhelmingly, metrically, the computer program 4-disc was the most preferred method for quantitative sex estimation. Most practitioners indicated that they report the sex classification results for each method they used, followed by reporting an estimated sex based on method or skeletal region preference. The remaining survey participants either decided based on experience, general impression, or they presented all of the results from every method employed, but then made a final assessment based on their opinion or experience with sex estimation. There are a number of problems and limitations with the currently available morphological methods for sex estimation. Most methods are restricted to a single skeletal region or a single bone, and for many of these methods, for example, Venus 1969, the traits being assessed are all weighted equally. Morphological methods also tend to either lack the use of statistics altogether and instead rely on a presence or absence or a majority rule. Other methods may use very simplistic statistics that either lack associated posterior probabilities for sex classification or associated error rates, which then calls into question the confidence of the resulting sex classification. In other instances, scoring is either not standardized, resulting in reliability issues, or the method utilizes features known to be unreliable, for example, the mental eminence in the Walker 2008 method. The impact of experience on the ability to reliably score traits is unknown for many of the methods currently available, and aside from the Human ID program by Berg and Kennyhurst, practitioners are unable to combine morphological data with metric data. Lastly, as pointed out in the ASB Standard 90, Standards for Sex Estimation in Forensic Anthropology, the impact of age, population variation, socioeconomic status, and secular change has not been well documented to determine what, if any, impact these confounding factors have on the currently available methods and/or traits that we use for sex estimation. There are also a number of limitations with currently available metric methods. Like the morphological methods, they are often restricted to one skeletal region or bone. There's also an inability to combine data types, and the impact of confounding factors are not well known for each method. Reliability issues center around location and identification of type 3 landmarks, and the methods are further complicated by the need for specialized equipment and training to collect the data. Lastly, comparative reference samples are limited. For example, in the popular program 4-disc, the skull and postcrania are analyzed separately, and while there are 13 reference sex and population groups for the skull, postcranial analyses are limited to only 4, American black and white males and females. There are some contentious issues surrounding sex estimation, including focusing on the terminology that's used and should not be used, including terms like gender, which has been included as recently as 2019 in scientific research publications. Also, whether or not we should be estimating subadult sex, and if we do estimate it, what is an acceptable age cutoff when we can begin to accurately and reliably assess sex, and what are acceptable accuracy levels? Should these be the same as those that we use in adults? Also, whether or not we should be using both data types, qualitative and quantitative, or one or the other based on perceived objectivity. And if we do use both, how can we combine the results into a single sex estimate? Then lastly, whether or not we should be working in the blind or instead using an informed analyses approach that allows us to perform our analyses using all of the available information so as to come to the most appropriate conclusions. Current challenges related to some of these contentious issues include shifting away from pedological dogma, like terminology and preferring the skull over the postcrania for sex estimation, despite research showing that the postcrania is better. A better understanding of the impact of age on skeletal robusticity and whether or not it's impacting morphological features that we use for sex estimation. A better understanding of population variation on feature expression and whether or not we need population-specific equations or methods. How secular change has impacted the traits and the methods that we use. Metrically, this has been studied a lot more than the morphological features that we use for sex estimation. Lastly, as ASB standard notes, there are confounding factors to consider when estimating sex, but we know very little about the actual, if any, effect of these factors at present on the methods or traits or features that we use for skeletal sex estimation. In an attempt to address some of these contentious issues, challenges, and to better understand some of the results obtained from the survey, I submitted an NIJ grant and was fortunate enough to receive funding in 2015 to gain a better understanding of the most popular morphological features used for sex estimation. This grant was an attempt to remedy some of the problems with the methods being used at the time, and the research focused on the 5 skull traits from Walker 2008 and the 3 pubic traits originally described by Phoenix in 1969, and that I later modified in 2012 with colleagues. The ultimate goal of this grant was integrating all of this research and results into a practical application for sex estimation, which eventually became known as the MorphoPASSE program. The 5 traits included for the skull are shown here and include the nupal crest, mastoid process, supraorbital margin, glabellar region, and the mental eminence. The traits are compared to the descriptions and the illustrations on the right, and then scored on an ordinal scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being the more gracile expression and 5 being the more robust expression. Based on the traits present, the scores are then input into one of Walker's 6 regression equations provided to then get an estimate of sex. Likewise, the 3 traits of the pubis, the ventral arc, the subpubic concavity or contour, and the medial aspect of the ischiopubic ramus are ordinally scored from 1 to 5 based on degree of expression with no assumption of male or femaleness. The 3 trait scores are then input into a logistic regression equation to estimate skeletal sex. I'll briefly cover the 5 main research objectives that were necessary to understand in order to develop the MorphoPASSE program. First, the validity of the regression equations from the 2 methods was tested. Walker had been more extensively studied than the Clails et al. Method, and the results from this research were consistent with previous findings. Overall, accuracy was low with a very high sex bias, and there was considerable population variation using the Walker traits and method. The pubic traits and the Clails et al. Method were more consistent with overall high accuracy and low sex bias, indicating that the original equation worked well. Next, reliability was examined in light of observer experience. The first observer was inexperienced and simply read the article and applied the method. The second observer was experienced, a graduate student with training and practical application in skeletal biology and sex estimation. And then lastly, an expert observer was a practicing forensic anthropologist with a PhD and extensive casework experience. Again, the Walker traits of the skull had been more extensively studied for reliability than the 3 pubic traits. Intra-observer agreement was high for all 5 traits, while inter-observer agreement varied. The mental eminence was found to be unreliable, which compared to previously published research, and the supraorbital margin only had acceptable levels of agreement for the experienced and experts observers, suggesting that some level of training and experience is required to appropriately score this feature. Both intra and inter-observer agreement was high for all 3 pubic traits, regardless of experience level. The reliability data collected during the grant then allowed us to source additional data from individuals beyond the data that was specifically collected for the grant so that it could be integrated into the MorphoPASSE program. Secular change was also examined. Overall, contemporary females are more gracile than females from the historic or prehistoric samples, thereby making it easier to differentiate between the sexes due to less overlap in trait scores that we encounter in modern forensic casework. Next, population variation was examined. Again, the skull traits have been more extensively studied, and our research was consistent in that there was considerable population variation in trait frequencies, although glabella was only significantly different between groups for the female samples. The ventral arc exhibited population variation among females, while the medial aspect of the ishiopubic ramus and the subpubic contour exhibited population variation in the male samples. Overall, the Asian and Hispanic-derived population samples had lower levels of sexual dimorphism than the other samples included in the grant research. Finally, the presence and impact of asymmetry for the bilateral traits was examined. Asymmetry occurred and generally consisted of a plus or minus score. Most traits were right dominant, meaning that the right side had a higher or more robust score than the left side. Significant differences in classification accuracy were found between the symmetric and asymmetric individuals for the pelvic traits. However, overall classification accuracy remained high, above 90%. No significant differences were found between the asymmetric and symmetric individuals for most of the Walker equations, with the exception of equation 6, which utilizes the nuchal crest and mastoid. Following this research, the secondary aim of the grant project was to develop a free interactive morphological database and program. MorphoPASSE, or the Morphological Pelvis and Skull Sex Estimation Program, is a free graphical user interface, or GUI, in which practitioners can enter, compare, and analyze morphological traits or features of their unknown forensic cases and compare them to a large modern sample with known demographic data in order to more accurately and easily estimate sex in a manner compliant with the Daubert criteria. The MorphoPASSE program is multivariate and multi-regional, combining the cranial traits with the pubic traits, and it allows the user to enter case-specific parameters to ensure the most appropriate reference sample is being used. For use of the program, we created a user manual that includes scoring procedure, the original and updated descriptions, drawings, in addition to real bone images, especially for the Walker 2008 method, which did not originally include them. Information about the samples and population is included, as well as user instructions for using the program itself and interpreting the results. There's also information about the statistical options available within the MorphoPASSE program, including the original Clails and Walker equations, as well as the revised and recommended random forest modeling. Here's an example of one of the trait description pages from the manual. It includes a description of the trait itself, the anatomical basis for it, and function. It also includes scoring procedures, so how to orient and hold the bone, what areas to focus on, and what features to consider. It also lists special considerations, times you should or should not score a particular feature, and anatomical variants that you may encounter. There are schematic representations of the ordinal scores from 1 to 5, as well as real bone examples of those images. And then the most important part of the manual is the revision of the traits, which I'll go through for each of the individual traits. But primarily with the Walker 2008 method, there are no intermediate trait descriptions. The original publication only describes trait scoring for scores 1, the most gracile, and score 5, the most robust. And then it's left up to the reader or the analyst to interpret what scores 2 through 4 mean along that range based on the images provided. In addition, Walker originally created those schematic drawings using sagittal sections for the glabella, the supraorbital margin, and the nuchal crest. So you're trying to translate what you're feeling on an entire skull and comparing that to images that were generated using a sagittal section. Also, many of the features, for example, the mental eminence, are considering multiple features or traits simultaneously, so the degree of projection of the tubercles in addition to overall area, but there's no information included on how to weight those features and which ones to give more priority to when scoring the features. Likewise, hindsight is 2020 with my Clails et al. Method. I also had features that are including multiple facets that have to be scored or weighted simultaneously, but this was not originally addressed in the first publication. And we modified the orientation for viewing the bone for the subpubic contour from the dorsal aspect to the ventral aspect, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. So I'll go through each of the 5 cranial traits and 3 traits of the pelvis based on the revised descriptions. The original schematic drawings are presented, as well as the real bone images that were integrated into the MorphoPASSE manual. Walker originally recommended feeling the region of the nuchal area and suggested focusing on the nuchal muscle attachment area, which included the external occipital protuberance. But what if the nuchal lines are pronounced but lack a hook, or vice versa? What if there is a large hook but very gracile nuchal lines? And what if an occipital bun is present? These were not addressed in the original publication. As I mentioned previously, Walker also originally created the scoring image with ordinal scores from 1 to 5 using a sagittal transection of a skull. So you have to translate an outline to what you can actually see in lateral view when holding or viewing an actual skull. For the modifications, we recommend also feeling the area as suggested by Walker. If the area is rough enough that you can kind of catch a fingernail on it, it's scored as a 3 or higher. So there's pronounced muscle markings present enough that you can feel or palpate them. Scores 4 and 5 are differentiated by an inferior projection of the external occipital protuberance that creates a hook in the more robust score of a 5. For the mastoid process, the image originally provided by Walker, shown on the right, emphasizes a change in the length of the mastoid from a short projection below the EAM to a longer projection in score 5. However, if you revisit the descriptions of the trait, he indicates that it should be scored based on overall volume compared to the external auditory meatus and the surrounding bony structures, not just the length. This image or ordinal scoring system is a bit misleading in that the emphasis is placed on length, but in reality, the scoring should be based on total volume. So our revision of this trait highlights the need to focus on overall volume rather than just width or length alone, and then to also consider the overall size of the temporal bone, specifically the external auditory meatus. For the supraorbital margin, Walker originally created the image with a sagittal transection of the skull, so that you have to translate an outline to what you can feel when pinching the area lateral to the supraorbital foramen or notch. Scoring should be based on overall thickness of the bone, which varies from the width of a dull knife blade that is either sharp and thin, or up to a blunted or rounded edge that is the width of a pencil in score 5. We modified this feature to also consider the posterior recurve into the superior orbits, as shown by the red arrows on the image. This trait is considered secondary to thickness and then can be used to help differentiate between neighboring scores. Likewise, Walker also originally created the glabella or supraorbital ridge brow ridge image with a sagittal transection of the skull. His descriptions focus on whether or not there is a projection of the glabellar region, which based on his images looks like the anterior projection beyond the landmark nasion, but this is not explicitly stated in his description. Brow ridge morphology has been shown to be highly variable, ranging from droopy, M-shaped arch, or high and low projection. Therefore, we have modified the description to include the entire brow ridge area when viewed laterally, not just the glabellar region, as the brow ridge can be quite pronounced in some individuals, but they may have a more depressed glabellar region. We also recommend touching the region and ignoring the distance or height of the most anterior projection above nasion. It should be scored wherever it is present. Walker's description of the mental eminence and images focus on 2 features simultaneously: the overall width of the mental eminence in relation to the mandible, and the projection of the tubercles from the mental eminence or mental trigon. Like the brow ridge, there is considerable variation in chin shape, and overall area and presence or absence of projections are not always perfectly correlated. We modified Walker's method to first focus on the presence or absence of the tubercles, regardless of if they are anteriorly or inferiorly projecting. If present, they are scored as a 3 or higher, based on the overall area of the mental trigon in relation to the overall width of the mandible. If absent, the individual is scored as a 1 or 2 based on the roundness or pointiness of the chin. Like some of the Walker traits, some of the Clails et al. Traits are problematic because two features are being considered simultaneously. For the ventral arc, primary weight should be given to the overall angle and orientation of the palpable bony ridge known as the ventral arc, which can be present in both males and females. This angle in relation to the symphysial face decreases with increasing scores and becomes more parallel to the face in scores 3, 4, and 5. Secondary to the ventral arc itself and the angle and orientation of it is the shape of the pubic bone overall and the size of the triangular portion of bone that is located inferior and medial to the ventral arc. This secondary feature can be used to differentiate between neighboring scores. Score 1 has a more squared appearance with a marked inferior corner, while scores 3 and above are more sloped and lack that corner because the additional triangle of bone is not present below the ventral arc. We expanded Phoenix's subpubic concavity and renamed it the subpubic contour to include the entire contour of the ischiopubic ramus. The original publication suggested viewing the feature from the dorsal view, as in my original 2012 publication. However, after a decade of teaching this, I found that individuals tend to underscore the trait in this view, so the MorphoPASSE manual recommends scoring the trait in ventral view. It also makes it much easier to score the ventral arc and then immediately score the subpubic contour because you're holding it in the same orientation and position. I recommend placing a finger along the length of the ramus and determining first if it is concave, a score of 1 or 2, straight, a score of 3, which is relatively rare, or convex, a score of 4 or 5. It should be noted that you're considering the entire length, as some individuals will exhibit a small convexity just below the symphysial face, but the overall ramus may be straight or more likely convex. Lastly, the medial aspect of the ischiopubic ramus was modified from Phoenix and the original Clails et al. Publication to include weighting of the features. Priority should be given to the presence or absence of a ridge or plateau of bone extending below the symphysial face approximately 1/3 of the way down the ramus. Note that some individuals will exhibit a shortened ridge just below the symphysial face that's only about 0.5 centimeter to 1 centimeter long. This is not a true dorsal ridge or plateau. If the ridge or plateau is present, the individual is scored as a 1 or 2 based on the sharpness. If not, the individual is scored as a 3 or above based on the overall width of the ramus in proportion to the surrounding structures and overall size of the entire innominate. So that was just a brief summation of the major changes to each of the 8 traits and a glimpse of the real bone images that were added to the MorphoPASSE manual. For using the actual program, I recommend becoming familiar with the range of variation in trait expression before actually scoring the traits. I also recommend using the revised figures, descriptions, and the schematics from the MorphoPASSE manual to score the traits, especially when you're using the advanced statistical options in MorphoPASSE. When scoring the features, it's important to note and include the feature weighting to differentiate between the ordinal scores. When bilateral scores are present for a case, both should be scored and input into the program, and the program should only include input of whole numbers. In some cases, you may not find a perfect score representation for your case, so score it based on the closest representation or eliminate that score from the analysis, and then choose the most appropriate parameters in the program when possible that match the parameters most similar to your forensic case. Here's a glimpse of the morphopasse.com website. The navigation bar on the left includes a trait exploration page shown here with the yellow arrow. Prior to using the program, I recommend that analysts visit this trait exploration page to get more familiar with the traits and the actual method before scoring them. This page includes each of the 8 traits and has examples of variants that can't or should not be scored, as well as a slideshow presentation that displays the range of trait variation present. These are especially important because individuals are often limited to the collections at the institutions at which they were trained, and these collections may not be totally representative of the true range of human variation in trait expression. There are also tests posted on the site where you can score the traits based on a series of images, and then check your answers to an answer key, which includes a full description and illustration of how I would score those traits and what the score is based upon. 2 examples are shown here for the ventral arc. On the MorphoPASSE website, under the Program tab on the left, you can access the Graphical User Interface, or GUI, and the MorphoPASSE User Manual, both which are currently in version 1. And it's posted in bright red letters, and despite appearing in cautionary red lettering, I have seen a number of instances where the MorphoPASSE program was utilized for sex classification, but rather than using the accompanying MorphoPASSE scoring manual, the analyst scored the traits based on Walker 2008 and Clayles et al. 2012, and then entered them into the MorphoPASSE program using the random forest modeling option. So please don't do this. You have an option to use the original equations, but if you're going to be using MorphoPASSE in the true spirit of the program and using the more advanced statistical methods of random forest modeling, use the scoring from the actual manual, not the original publication. So here's a screenshot of the MorphoPASSE online GUI. On the left side of this input screen, shown by the arrows, the analyst enters their name or initials and the case ID into the text boxes. This information will then appear on the output report. On the right-hand side, you have the score input for each trait that is available for your particular case. The program is nice because it can work with missing data and does not require that each trait be present to predict sex. It is recommended that you include both the left and right side scores for the 5 bilateral traits, and that only integers are input into the score boxes. The program is set to upper and lower bounds, which restricts the score inputs from 1 to 5. Any decimal places that are entered are read as the whole number only, and no rounding occurs. For example, a score of 1, 1.2, 1.5, and 1.9 would all be entered into the model as a score of 1. Based on the results from the reliability research conducted during the phase 1 of the grant, it is recommended that the mental eminence not be included in analyses, which is why it's shown here in red. Also on the left-hand side of the input screen are the case-specific parameter options, including the temporal period, ancestry or population if known, and global region. Unknown options are also included for each of these 3 parameters. The entire reference sample, which is described in much more detail in the user manual, consists of 2,245 individuals from 15 worldwide skeletal collections, shown on the map here. As the analyst selects the parameters on the left, the sample size shown in the yellow box above will adjust accordingly. It is recommended that the analyst uses the most appropriate parameters for their specific case. When I'm analyzing a forensic case derived from the United States, I select contemporary for temporal period and US for the region. In most cases, I will select unknown for ancestry or population group, as this is also often being estimated as one of the biological profile parameters and is not known for my casework. The analyst can choose from 2 methods to analyze the data. The original Walker and Clayles et al. Logistic regression equations analyze the skull and pelvis independent of one another. Although not the recommended statistical application for MorphoPASSE and the revised traits, I opted to include these in the program for ease of calculation for those still utilizing the older method. Shown here on the slide, you can see the 6 traits included for Walker for the American English sample, and then the 3 traits and single logistic regression equation for Clayles et al. After selecting the Run Analysis button on the input screen, the program will automatically switch over to the output display, which is shown here for an example test case. On the top, you can see the results from the Walker 2008 method based on 2 of the equations, as well as the results and sex prediction for the Clails et al. Logistic regression equation. The recommended statistical application in MorphoPASSE is random forest modeling, which is a flexible machine learning algorithm. Using bootstrap aggregation of a random training subset from the MorphoPASSE database, the algorithm creates a series of hundreds of decision trees known as an ensemble or forest based on many random subsets of the variables and repeated sampling. Thousands of random cutoff points in the training sample are determined on the fly at each decision node or branch to determine the most accurate pooling of the sexes. The consensus of the training ensemble is then used to determine the best classification rules for the entered case, which in the case of MorphoPASSE is a binary sex classification of male or female. The more trees in the forest, the more robust or higher the accuracy for sex prediction. This approach is self-validating and prevents overfitting by only selecting the most valuable input traits and their scores for classification. Other benefits of random forest modeling include that it is non-parametric, whereby the model is based on the data entered instead of being specified a priori, and it makes no assumptions about the data, such as requirements of normal distribution or sample size requirements. Here I will walk you through the output report for a test case. I recommend downloading the output report and saving it with your case bench notes, as the downloaded report contains much more information than shown on the output screen within the GUI itself. The major components of the analyses are listed first, including the analyst's name or initials, the case number, the program version, and the date of analysis. Next, the input parameters are shown, as well as the trait scores input into the GUI. The first major component of the analysis displayed is the case prediction, which provides the probability of sex membership for your unknown case. In this example, the case is classified as female with a probability of 72.8% based on a comparative reference sample of 447 individuals. Next, the test or model accuracy is displayed. This tests the classification model created on the fly for the unknown case on a holdout sample from within the database, thereby cross-validating the results. In this example, the classification accuracy is 92% with a kappa value of 84%. The kappa statistic provides model accuracy taking into account random chance and will typically be lower than the accuracy rate. Sensitivity, specificity, and the positive and negative predictive values are also included. When reporting the results from MorphoPASSE in a case report, I will include the case prediction results with the probability of sex as shown on the last slide, as well as the sample size, model accuracy, and kappa value. The training model accuracy is next, and this is the cross-validated classification accuracy of the entire sample used to create the ensemble. MorphoPASSE uses 10 folds repeated 10 times. Again, the classification accuracy for the model is presented, as well as the kappa statistic, which will typically be lower. mTri is the number of variables randomly sampled as candidates for each decision node or branch in the ensemble, and for the MorphoPASSE program, it will always be 2. The confusion matrix presents the accuracy of the model based on true negatives, true positives, false positives, and false negatives. Lastly, variable importance is displayed, which is the mean decrease in the Gini coefficient or the overall importance of each of the variables when classifying sex. The most important variable will be the one with the highest mean decrease in the out of the bag error estimate based on bootstrap aggregation. In general, the ventral arc and subpubic contour will carry the most weight, followed by the glabella and mastoid process. Often the supraorbital margin will be excluded, as was the case in this example. There are a number of benefits to using random forest modeling in MorphoPASSE rather than the original Walker and Clails et al. Logistic regression equation. First, random forest modeling is statistically more robust and self-validating. The parameters allow the analyst to select the most appropriate reference samples to compare their unknown to as well. The program is able to combine sexually dimorphic data from multiple features and skeletal regions into a single estimate of sex rather than looking at them independently. The method has high validity and reliability and produces a classification probability with a known error rate. Lastly, the program can handle missing data and works well with the fragmentary and incomplete remains often encountered in forensic contexts. So what are some of the future directions for sex estimation? And then I'll talk about how this ties into the future directions for MorphoPASSE. As a field, we need to move beyond minimum standards now that we have them and start to develop best practice guidelines for the biological profile parameters, including sex estimation. We need to try and gain a better understanding of decedents that have socially or medically transitioned and recognize that currently our methods for sex estimation are limited to a binary outcome, although biological sex and gender exist on a spectrum. Focus should be placed on developing methods that weight traits, combine skeletal regions, and integrate quantitative and qualitative measures into a single estimate. In my opinion, there needs to be greater accessibility, free graphical user interfaces rather than paid programs, and we need to see the transition of geometric morphometric approaches into applications that are more user-friendly. There are a number of studies that have demonstrated high levels of spectral dimorphism in different bones or skeletal regions, but there's no way to practically apply that information at present. And then lastly, we should talk about or think about integrating posterior probability informed thresholds for sex estimation. What posterior probability is appropriate for confidence in our ability to estimate sex? So that leads me to expansion of the MorphoPASSE program. Kayla Shoto at the University of North Texas Health Science Center in Fort Worth and I were recently awarded grant funding, actually this month, through the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Justice for a project, Sex Estimation in Forensic Anthropology, taking a legally informed approach to method development. One of the main aims of the project is to test the validity and reliability of additional morphological features of the skeleton for their utility for sex estimation, and then to integrate the sexually dimorphic traits with standard osteometrics from programs like 4DISC and DSP for the pelvis. This expansion will include additional features of the innominate beyond just the 3 pubic traits and features from the overall articulated pelvis, some of which are shown here from Rogers and Saunders, Bruzek et al., Walker 2005, and Rennie 2018. Features of the sacrum will also be included as part of the pelvic complex, so anterior projection as mentioned by Rogers and Saunders, as well as proportion of the ala to the body, overall shape of the sacrum and anterior curvature. Also to be included for the morphological features are features of the cervical vertebra, including bifidity, features of the distal humerus as described by Rogers and modified and tested by Vance et al. 2011. Features of the medial clavicle, including the rhomboid fossa, and then features of the scapula, including spine shape and angle and orientation of the superior border. There will be a larger expansion of the cranial traits beyond the 5 listed in Walker. These will include the features listed in Williams and Rogers 2006, additional features described by Langley et al. 2017, and those from the Human ID program by Berg and Kennyhurst describing features of the mandible. Sources are provided here that contain more information on specific aspects of research that's already been published based on MorphoPASSE. So some of that analyses examining the reliability of the traits, the role of experience. There's also a book chapter that details the program itself in the book Sex Estimation of the Human Skeleton. Stephanie Cole presented research on the effects of the skeletal asymmetry and how that impacts sex classification. And then the MorphoPASSE program has also been independently tested by the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences, as well as the Washburn University Forensic Anthropology Recovery Unit for integration into their SOPs for sex estimation. I want to thank the following agencies for funding and collection access for the original grants and the forthcoming grant, as well as all the research collaborators that contributed data to the MorphoPASSE program, as well as the graduate research assistant on the grant and student assistants at Washburn. And then lastly, the logo designer, GUI creator for the MorphoPASSE program, and those that provided statistical assistance. For more information about the current state of skeletal sex estimation or about the MorphoPASSE program, feel free to email me or check out my edited volume, Sex Estimation of the Human Skeleton, or a recently published article in the journal Forensic Anthropology on the current state of sex estimation in forensic anthropology. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela Askeles, and I'm currently a public health analyst in the Center for Forensic Sciences at RTI International. Thank you so much, Dr. Clails, for such an informative presentation. We're going to get started with the Q&A session. If anyone has any questions, feel free to just put them in the Q&A pod. Thanks. We received quite a few pre-webinar questions, so we will be alternating between those and then the ones in the Q&A pod. So for the first question today, Dr. Clails, how often do you see ambiguous pelvises with more distinctive skulls?
My experience has been that it's very infrequent. It's usually the other way around, where the skulls are more ambiguous. We've had a number of cases, at least with the WUFRO casework that we do, where the skull was more intermediate. And if we didn't have a pelvis in those particular cases, we would put more weight on the postcranial metrics. Typically with the pelvis, the three traits are not going to all be ambiguous. One or two of them may be. There was one case where it was a younger individual where we just went with indeterminate and chose not to report the sex due to lack of confidence in the result.
Okay, thank you. And I know you've kind of touched on this in your future directions for sex estimation, but we have a question in the Q&A pod regarding the accuracy of sex estimation when it comes to an individual's lived identity, in terms of does it not match their biological sex assigned at birth, and for transgender individuals who may not have fully transitioned, or even intersex individuals, how might MorphoPASSE or similar models account for this?
Well, at present, we can't account for this, unfortunately. We don't know a lot about the impact of hormonal transitions for those that have medically transitioned prior to puberty. And so unfortunately, from a forensic anthropological standpoint, our methods are limited to sort of a binary result, male or female. So the program itself cannot account for individuals that have transitioned or in the process of transition. We're simply able to report on what we can see on the skeletal form, and that may not necessarily match their gender or their lived identity.
Okay. On to the next question. How reliable is it to use this method if a pelvic or cranial feature is absent?
I'm assuming this question is more on the validity of the method. So how valid or accurate is the method if we don't have all of the features? And so based on that assumption, the model itself will tell you in the program. I'm a really big fan of Patty Evans' paper that came out in 2021 in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, looking at posterior probability informed thresholds for sex estimation. And they recommended 0.85 as the PPIT, where accuracy was at over 92% or higher. And that also reduced the sex and population accuracy biases. And then they suggest also that a posterior probability below 0.75 should not be assigned a sex in forensic casework. So I take that research into consideration. I look at the model accuracy, the training model accuracy, and then the accuracy for the random forest model for my unknown individual based on the features that are present, and consider that and whether it's above that 0.85 threshold or not when having confidence in reporting that sex estimation. So frequently, I do use the program with our casework without all of the features present, but I really rely on what the models are telling me and interpreting the output.
Okay. And speaking on validity, I believe someone has asked if your research has been validated or peer reviewed.
So the program itself has been validated independently by our lab, but then also by several other institutions doing forensic casework. It's similar in the way that 4DISC operates in that it's self-validating. So the program itself will give you the output of the validation for the model itself, and then also the parameters for your specific case. Um, the article, we haven't actually published an article on the program itself, just a book chapter. So that in itself has not been peer reviewed in that capacity, but the program is self-validating. And I completely welcome people to do validation studies. We have the data available from the grant and encourage others to collect outside data and test the program in different samples.
That's understandable. From your presentation, it seems like, this program's still in its first version, so I'm sure there's always room for improvement.
Mhm. Yeah, hindsight's always 2020. You find stuff later that you're like, oh, I should have done this, or ways to improve it or modify it. And that was
Mhm.
really the impetus for Kate Lachotto and I expanding the program and continuing to improve it. It's not a stagnant process.
For sure. Um, Now this kind of connects back to a previous question, but what are your thoughts about using a single feature, especially if they're very robust or gracile? How would you report this?
I personally would never rely on a single feature for sex estimation in a forensic context. Again, you can input a single feature into the program. It will give you the model accuracy for the training model as well as for your unknown individual. You'll have an associated posterior probability and a kappa value. In cases where I have very limited material, maybe a couple of features for the morphology, I will still collect that data. I'll still analyze it, but then I will integrate that with the information that I'm also getting from other methods, like using the 4DISC program, looking at postcranial metrics, looking at cranial metrics as well. And in cases where the remains are very limited, at least for our reports in the WUFRU, we have a caveat statement in there saying that the biological profile estimate was limited due to the incomplete nature of the remains. Or we may just completely say indeterminate for sex or other biological profile parameters if we are too limited in what's available.
Gotcha. Thank you for answering that. We have another question in the Q&A pod related to how do forensic anthropologists work around body modifications such as bone grinding? Have you seen this in any of the cases you've worked on?
I personally have not seen any of it. I've done a lot of background literature review in the clinical and medical literature to better understand that, because I think that is really important for forensic anthropologists to recognize when we see signatures of body modifications in any individual. So popular things include rib removal, stiletto surgery, facial feminization surgeries, rhinoplasties, implants. And so recognizing those cultural modifications to the body, especially those that impact skeletal form, and recognizing when there may be indicators suggesting cultural modifications or medical transitioning where the gender may not align necessarily with what we're seeing for biological sex. But again, there's a lot more that needs to be done in that area, in my opinion, and much more research that needs to be conducted.
All right, we have another question about how many traits can the assessment of sex be made? For example, if there are only 3 features in the skull or 2 in the pelvis, or only one side of those indicated in the method, how reliable is the assessment using the program?
So again, I'm assuming this is really referring to validity and the accuracy of the method. You can use it with a combination of features. So if you only have 3 from the skull and 2 from the pelvis, I would still estimate sex with those numbers. But again, it's really anything can be put into the program. It's making sure you take the time to actually look at and interpret the output, and that will help you determine the confidence level. What is your posterior probability for the model and your individual? What are the kappa values, which tell you the accuracy above random chance? And so interpreting the program output into allowing you to either be confident or not confident in your output. And then also looking at other skeletal indicators. I'll never rely just on MorphoPASSE and just on the morphological features. I will always look at the metric data as well when making a final estimate.
Thank you. The next two questions in the Q&A pod kind of relate to your random forest modeling. The first one is, are users able to contribute to the data available for the random forest modeling? For example, if a jurisdiction has a resolved case with known sex and identity, can they input the appropriate scores and measurements to be used for future statistical estimations?
Yeah, so we do actively collect data, including what we use for our WUPRU cases, and periodically update the program with that additional data with known identified individuals based on the parameters that can be selected. So we will always take data from individuals if they have positive identification. And a lot of that is based on the grant results that we obtained, showing that with the exception of the mental eminence, the traits are reliable and can be reliably scored.
And when you say you take data from them, do you mean the person needs to input it themselves, or if they come to you?
They can, so the data can be sent on to us. We don't have an option where a user can input their own data or make their own database with their information. They can provide it, and we offer two options to it. There can be public data that's entered into the MorphoPASSE database that anybody can request or use by filling out a research request, or it can be private, where it's not visible to outside or public users, which is a lot of the data from the grant that was contributed, as well as the case data that was input into it. And that is only used behind the scenes for the random forest modeling. So only myself and the GUI programmer would have access to that.
Okay, I gotcha. Thank you. And then related to that, how did you or perhaps the random forest model assign these different weights to the traits? Do they relate with their discriminative power or the amount of sexual dimorphism they carry?
So it's based on, in random forest modeling, it finds the best combination of traits and then assigns those based on the multiple iterations of the ensemble and the decision nodes at the tree. Statistics is not my favorite thing in the entire world, so I had a lot of consultation on that side of things, as well as paying an individual programmer for that. But the weights assigned to the traits are based on their utility when creating the ensemble for differentiating between the sexes.
Okay, awesome. Can you also comment on reporting sex and gender in specific case reports? Do you have any specific case reports you'd like to share your thoughts on?
So generally when I'm reporting sex in a case report, I will present the results from the methods that were utilized. And I can actually drop an example in the chat of how I report sex for the MorphoPASSE program. But generally I put the number of features that were input from what areas, what the probability was, the model accuracy, as well as kappa. And then I'll present that for the other methods that were used. So for using human ID, or for using Fortis, for cranial and postcranial metrics, I'll report the results for all of those. And then in the event that those don't correspond with one another, and there's cases where we might put indeterminate. I will say from the casework that I have down here, where we have positive identification, the majority of those align. We don't see a lot of discrepancies between the metrics and the morphology here. And I presented a summary of our case reports down here that have been positively identified for the entire bioprofile at a conference a few years ago, a regional one. So I'll report everything. As far as gender goes, we will report information in our case report if we see any indicators of skeletal modifications that may be associated with medical transitioning or just modifications to the skeleton in general in our individualizing traits and characteristics section. If we do the recovery or are provided with the clothing, so sometimes we'll get the bones still in the clothing because a full sort of autopsy is not performed, we will include any of the cultural artifacts that are associated with the remains in a specific section of the report. And there can be cases where they don't necessarily align with the sex estimate. I should say that in all of our reports for the WUFRU, under the biological profile section, we have a sort of caveat statement that says that not all of the biological profile, or excuse me, to note that all biological profile parameters are considered estimates in forensic anthropology. And then the specific statement that we have on sex estimation says that it refers to an individual's biological sex as assigned at birth and or chromosomal sex, and it may or may not correspond with the individual's gender, i.e. their sociocultural identity. Although biological sex is not binary, current methods for sex estimation in forensic anthropology are limited to two options, male or female. So it's really important to me, and we have a statement like that for each of the biological profile parameters to communicate to our audience. Ooh, we just lost the motion sensor lighting in my office. 1 second, I'm gonna have to walk around here. Been sitting in the same spot for too long. It's really important for us to communicate to our stakeholders and those that are going to eventually be the audience of our case reports, the difference between sex and gender and the limitations of what we can and can't do in forensic anthropology.
Yeah, I can see how having a statement like that would be very helpful on those reports.
And I can just, I just pulled up a case report really quickly, so I can just kind of drop in just an example of like the short summary of what we use for MorphoPASSE, so that's in the chat.
All right, perfect. We have a question from an audience member asking, are you going to include features and measurements of the femur, acetabulum too, or?
So we definitely are including measurements of the femur and the pelvis. The acetabulum is part of the pelvis. So we'll be collecting all of the measurements in the program Fortis, as well as all the measurements in the DSP program. And then we have not identified any features of the femur to add to the program, morphological features for sex estimation, or for the acetabulum beyond sort of angle and orientation of it. So not a ton with the morphological features, but definitely metrics will be integrated for both of them after their utility has been tested as part of the grant.
Okay, yeah, thank you for answering that. I have another question from the pre-submitted ones. How much of the ventral surface should the arc occupy in order to be considered a valid bony ridge consistent with a ventral arc? For example, if there's a very minimal bony ridge on the inferior 1/3, is that enough to be considered a ridge, especially in older adults where bony outgrowths in the region may be common?
So I would still score it if it was up to 1/3. More often I see it creeping up to about the halfway mark, but there are cases where once in a while it's only about 1/3 of that total length of the pubic symphysis or the height of the pubic symphysis. So I would still score it, but I would probably make a note in my bench notes. And then when you're scoring that feature, you're also secondarily looking at the overall bone shape. So I would take that into consideration as well. If there's really significant osteophytic growth, I would probably advise against scoring it. So if there's extensive growth or modifications in that region due to extreme old age. But in my experience, that's been fairly rare.
Okay. Now that question was related to elderly adults, and we have an audience member asking, have you found that this method works as well for those who are elderly?
So this is another area where more research needs to be done. We currently don't know, fully know the impact of age on changes to these skeletal features. There's been one publication with a smaller-ish sample size suggesting that age does not impact our ability to accurately score them, and that we're not seeing, there's been publications in the past, I would say 90s, if I was just thinking off the top of my head here, that said that certain features like the crania becomes more robust in older females. So we have a couple publications looking at the crania, fewer, only a single one looking at the pelvis, suggesting that age does not impact our ability, and we don't see significant changes. in that robustness or gracile form, but there needs to be way more research done on this area, and the impact of age is not well understood. It's one of those confounding factors that we need to learn more about.
Okay. Thank you for answering that. And then in young folks still completing fusion of the epiphysis around the pubic bone, how can that impact what might that look like with a ridge? And do you find it more difficult to access the ventral arc in younger versus older adults? Apologies, this question is the
So I think the
wording.
question is, yeah, so just essentially asking, if we can assess the ventral arc, if the epiphyses aren't totally fused, and what we should look for. Again, personally, I don't score the pubic features unless all of the epiphyses are fused and that region is skeletally mature, again, because it has not been well studied and well documented in those that are not skeletally mature. There is a publication, I believe it's Sutherland 1990 or 1991, that identified what they called a precursor arc that starts to occur in individuals around 14 years of age, but this has not been well studied. I haven't noticed any significant trends by age, but again, age-related changes in trait expression need to be explored, and we don't know enough about subadults, in my opinion, to be using it.
I see. Thank you for answering that. We have another question from the audience related more toward the MorphoPASSE database. They're wondering if you're able to speak more about the optimization parameters used on the supervised machine learning algorithm, as well as what the test accuracy versus the validation accuracy as presented by the ML algorithm.
Okay, so some of this I'm not going to be able to speak on with a lot of clarity. There's a reason I paid people that know a lot more about this than me to figure this part out, statisticians and the programmer. But let me pull back the question again here. Sorry, just got switched over. So the test accuracy and the validation accuracy. So the validation accuracy is testing the model on the entirety of the sample of individuals, the holdout sample in the program, to see how well or how accurate it works on those individuals. So it's totally excluding or not even considering your unknown individual. Then the test accuracy is classifying the accuracy rate for your unknown individual and the on-the-fly parameters that were selected. So essentially the ensemble and the decision nodes. And in the program itself, the test is done 500 times, so it's 10 repeated tries with 2 per node and 10 samples per time. So it's pretty robust in that capacity. And so that's probably the most that I could speak upon without talking or getting more details from the statistician. 3 or 4 years ago when we were going through all the options and why, I really relied heavily on their expertise in that area.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure whatever audience member asked that question today, I'm sure you can, if they do have further questions for your statistician or developer,
feel free.
I'm sure you can connect them with them.
Yep. Yeah, I actually just got a question like 2 or 3 weeks ago that I wasn't quite sure the parameter and the coding in the program, and reached out to the statistician, their programmer, and got an answer. So feel free to reach out if you have specific questions, and I can get an answer for you on those.
All right. And then also from an audience member, they're asking if they can request access to the data bank for future research use, and if so, what are the requirements?
Yes, so there is a research request form on the MorphoPASSE website where you have to describe the projects, the use for it, the specific data that you're included, and only the data that was collected either specifically for the grant or that was contributed with the notion of it being publicly accessible will become available. All of that data is anonymized, so there's no identifying information included, and only the parameters that are requested are provided to the individual. And so I don't think enough people are using the data. So feel free to reach out. I think we've only had maybe 2 or 3 people in the years since the program's been out requesting the database data and using it.
All right, great. And then, yeah, you said that can be found on the website, right? That form.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a tab, I believe, let me just double check that I think, yeah, it says research request on the left-hand side and has the form available for download.
All right, perfect. The next question is just a simple one. They're asking if it's more correct to say sex estimation or sex determination.
So this is a big pet peeve of mine. And even when the ASB document was going through review, I put it in the comments, the public comments. In my opinion, we should be saying that we are estimating sex. The only way that sex can be determined is through DNA analyses, and that's not without its own caveats. Again, thinking about our audience, when you use the word determine, it implies accuracy of 100%, and that accuracy rate is just not approachable with the methods that we currently have available. So we are estimating someone's biological sex based on their skeletal form, and that's just a huge kind of sticky wicky for me that I always a big pet peeve of mine that I climb a mountain for is that we should be using sex estimation, not sex assessment, which doesn't include statistical parameters or probabilities, and not sex determination, which could be considered known or misinterpreted based on the colloquial use of the word.
Yeah, and I know that's I know that differs from person to person. So thank you for clarifying your stance on that. So I know you kind of answered this before, but we have a person in the Q&A pod who's asked, well, they've stated that in Greek IDs, the sex in the ID can be changed even without the individual transitioning at all. And the information change is not often available to them. So how would you move forward with that?
I think that we can only provide what we're seeing from skeletal form, and there's a chance that that's just not going to match with the social identity of the person, how that person is perceived by themselves, their peers. It's a huge problem. We have to think about who reports the person missing and what gender or sex they're reporting for that individual. And it's not a problem just with sex estimation. We see it with, ancestry or biological population affinity and how someone identifies socially culturally as a race, how they're perceived by their peers, who's reporting them missing. Also inconsistencies with reported stature versus measured stature. So this is, a problem we see with a lot of the other parameters, and unfortunately are really limited by what we're looking at and trying to do the best that we can to help that person get identified.
All right, thank you. And then another person has asked, does having a sex change the actual bone structure? If so, how? Also, how does hormones play a role in that?
So individuals that have medically transitioned can undergo various different medical procedures as part of that medical transition, and that's so completely separate from their social or cultural transition. And so those different procedures are, really personalized to the individual. And sorry, I lost the question again. So there are changes that impact bone structure. So things like facial feminization surgery, where you have shaving of the bone. And so you'll see remodeling in that area, or removal of ribs, or stiletto surgery, where you're actually losing parts of the bone that should be visible on skeletal form. The issue is whether or not we as forensic anthropologists are trained to recognize that. And I think a lot more research has to be done on making sure that we understand that better. And then also, how do hormones play a role? So the skeletal differences that we see between the sexes are primarily arising because of hormonal changes at or around the time of puberty. And so with the ability of an individual to medically transition or take hormone blockers or additional hormones prior to puberty, that's going to impact their skeletal form. But we do not have a good understanding of how that impacts their skeletal form. To date, it's very under-researched and not well understood at this point in time. So it will impact it because hormones are, responsible for the secondary sex characteristics that we see in skeletal form.
I was going to ask, do you know if there's any current or future research by anyone?
Not that I'm aware of. It is a topic that is really interesting and important to me. And I spend a lot of time, I teach a ton of classes, so I don't have a lot of time for reading during the school year, but usually in the summer, it's a topic that I revisit and just kind of go to the clinical literature, see what's new, see what's being published. There are a couple of forensic anthropologists, a couple graduate students that are really interested in this topic and that have recently had theses just kind of laying out the basic ground foundation, like what is the frequency of medical transitions? What are we seeing? Getting access to CT scans from the clinical literature to better understand it. So I think it's an area where more research is being done and there's more interest in it. And I do try to revisit that every, 6-7 months, every year to see kind of where we're at, because I do think it's not well understood and I do think it's really important.
All right, so we're coming up to our last question in the Q&A pod. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to put them in there now. But this last question refers to, so there's male and female, but the audience member has learned of a third option, indeterminate. Is this no longer acceptable?
So I would say that indeterminate is not is referring to our inability to have confidence in our sex estimate, not necessarily indeterminate in the person's biological sex. And so there are plenty of cases, either for ancestry population affinity or age estimation or sex estimation or some combination of them where we might not have all the bones available, they're inconclusive, where I will list it as indeterminate for any of those features, but it's indeterminate in terms of my estimate, not indeterminate as, their biological or sociocultural gender.
Right, and I believe you referred to this earlier in your presentation. I mean, MorphoPASSE will also, right, when you download a report, there might be cases where where it's inconclusive.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the Midwest thing, but I can't tell you how many times we'll get like 1 or 2 bones, or just like a mandible or crania, and brought to us at the lab, and you're just really limited on, what you're able to say. And you don't want to, we'll still put all the results in, but I want to make it very, very clear that those results are limited. If we don't have a pelvis, I'll say we're missing the most sexually dimorphic portion of the skeleton. So these estimates should be interpreted with caution, and no sex should be excluded when looking for a positive identification for this individual.
All right, well, that's all the questions we have in the Q&A pod. If anyone else had any others they want to put in there before we close out. There are no further questions. You might go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. Feel free to reach out.
There's one more in the, sorry. There was one more in the Google Docs that I got ahead of time on how we should account for the flaring of the ischiopubic ramus when scoring the subpubic contour. And so I'm not totally sure what the person meant by the flaring. So flaring happens just with the convexity, but then we also can see flaring occurring with older age individuals where we see osteophytic growth in that area. And I will still use the entire length of the ramus and the overall pattern of it, convex versus concave and straight, to make that determination. So typically if we see that flaring, it's going to help us even more clearly see the convexity of it.
Thank you. Thank you for catching that last question. Oh, it looks like we have a couple more. Perfect. So one audience member has asked if you've seen any statistical significant sex estimation regions, features, change from populations 1,000 years old to historical populations to then contemporary ones.
We've only looked at historical populations compared to contemporary populations, and what we've seen is that females on average are becoming more gracile, so the lower trait scores, so it's actually becoming easier to differentiate between the sexes. Unfortunately, the grant was funded for forensic purposes, and just sort of due to a lack of available samples, I personally have not looked at populations 1,000 years old compared to historic or contemporary populations, but I suspect we would see some of those secular changes occurring as well.
All right. And then one more question. What references would you recommend for high school forensic classes on skeletal ID?
Oh, that is a tough one. There used to be a really great website that I think used Java and shut down. I actually really like the open access biological anthropology textbook has a chapter on forensic anthropology, which I think has good images and a simplistic explanation for people kind of first learning. It's open access, it's free, can be downloaded. There are a couple of things in there on the trauma section I think that I don't necessarily agree with or find accurate, but I think overall it's a good quick introduction to how we estimate the biological profile parameters. It's also, I think, written for that introductory audience as well. And so I think it's a good resource when you're just kind of first learning about it at the high school level.
All right, great. And then we have one audience member. They wanted to clarify their previous question. I think this one related to, the Greek IDs, but they wanted to say that their question was more about the data pool of missing people. They need a correct data pool to ID those missing people. And the data pool here is, well, in Greece is based 100% on the ID information.
Yeah, that is really problematic. I haven't looked at NamUs recently, but just the fact, at least in the United States, the options are listed as male or female under gender. And so I think more recently there's been an attempt to kind of add in gender information as well versus biological sex, but I don't know that for sure. I suspect a similar issue is going to force the issue, I guess, perhaps in Greece, where when a person is missing, you should be relying on, their identification, but then also on investigative work. So who's reporting them missing? What are the analyses, DNA, biology, forensic anthropology telling you as well?
And then one more question asking if is there a good reference for height estimation based on bone length for Asian ethnic groups?
I do not have a good answer for that one. That's kind of outside my scope there. If anybody in the chat knows, feel free to drop it in, but I do not have a good answer for that one.
All right, I think that does wrap up all the Q&A questions in the pod. If anyone has further questions, feel free to reach out to Dr. Clails or the FTCOE. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you so much, Dr. Clails, for such a wonderful presentation and answering all of those questions for everyone.
Thanks for having me. And as Michaela said, feel free to reach out if you have any questions, concerns about the program, or just anything about sex estimation in general. Again, thanks for having me.
Thank you for attending today's webinar. As you depart, we kindly ask that you take a minute or two to complete our post-webinar survey. The link will be pasted in the chat and also appear as you exit the Zoom room. Your feedback helps us improve our webinars and continue providing the best experience possible. Lastly, we encourage you to check out our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. You can find those links on the webinar page. There are also links to the Just Science Podcast SoundCloud and a link to subscribe to the FTCOE newsletter. Like, follow, or subscribe to stay up to date with everything the FTCOE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.